Welcome back, you night owls. Tonight we journey back to a world of gilded cages, whispering shadows, and a young man who would become the very sun around which his entire nation revolved. As you lie there, the world outside your window is quiet, but in the halls of the Louvre it's a cacophony of ambition, betrayal, and the first stirrings of a power so absolute it would change Europe forever. We're not just talking about politics tonight, though. We're talking about the private, often spicy life of Louis XIV, the man who built Versailles, a palace that was both a monument to his ego and a gilded prison for his nobles. You probably won't survive this, not with your modern sensibilities intact, so let's set the stage. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're feeling adventurous, drop your location and local time in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories travel. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Close your eyes for a moment and picture a small, scared boy. He's not a king yet, not really. He's just a child, and his name is Louis. The year is 1648, and Paris is not the city of light you know. It's a city of riots and barricades, a place where the people, the frondeurs as they're called, are openly defying the crown. You can almost hear the roar of the mob outside the Palais Royal, where the royal family is holed up. This isn't a fairy tale kingdom. It's a powder keg, and this young Louis is sitting right on top of it. He's only 10 years old, and he's witnessing the fundamental fragility of his world firsthand. He's learning a lesson that will echo through his entire reign, that power, unless it is absolute, can be taken from you in an instant. The rebellion, known as the Fronde, wasn't a peasant uprising. It was a chaotic civil war, led by high-ranking nobles and even the Parisian parliament, against the regency government of his mother, Anne of Austria, and her chief minister, the formidable Cardinal Mazarin. Imagine being a child and seeing the very men who are supposed to be your loyal subjects turn against you. One night, the mob even breaks into the palace, demanding to see the young king, to confirm he hasn't been spirited away. You can almost feel the cold sweat on his brow as he pretends to be asleep in his bed. The mob filing past, their faces a mix of defiance and curiosity. This is not a life of privilege. It's a life of constant threat. A life of seeing your power, your dignity, and your safety questioned on a daily basis. This visceral experience of humiliation and danger left an indelible mark on young Louis. It's a mainstream historical fact that the Fronde shaped his political philosophy. He came to believe, with every fibre of his being, that the nobility had to be controlled, that Paris was a dangerous city to be in, and that the only way to ensure the stability of the state was to centralise all power in the hands of the monarch. This wasn't just a theory for him, it was a scar on his psyche. He'd never forget the feeling of being a helpless child, a pawn in a game played by men who were meant to serve him. This would be the genesis of Versailles, a magnificent gilded cage where he could keep his troublesome nobles close, under his watchful eye, and distracted by an endless cycle of elaborate ceremonies and courtly intrigue. While the Fronde was a very public display of unrest, there's a quirky fringe tidbit that speaks to the paranoia of the era. Following the king's narrow escapes and the general chaos, there was a widespread belief among the populace that the young king was in grave danger not just from revolutionaries but from sorcery and poison. Pamphlets and rumours circulated about spells being cast on the king and his family. The superstition wasn't limited to the poor, it was a dark current that ran through the highest echelons of society. Even the Cardinal Mazarin, a shrewd political operator, took such threats seriously, employing an astrologer to advise on the king's health and future. It's a strange blend of high politics and low superstition, painting a picture of a world where science and reason were still jostling for space with ancient fears. This fear of a hidden, malicious world would surface again decades later in one of the darkest scandals of Louis's reign, the affair of the poisons. Historians still argue whether the Fronde was a genuine revolutionary movement or just a last gasp effort by the old feudal aristocracy to reclaim power from a strengthening monarchy. Some see it as a precursor to the French Revolution, a moment when the seeds of discontent were sown. Others view it more cynically, as a power grab by a selfish nobility who ultimately cared more about their own interests than the good of the people. This academic debate highlights the complexity of the era, but for Louis himself the lesson was simple and clear. Never again would he allow anyone to challenge his authority. In this chaotic environment, a new power dynamic was taking shape, one that would deeply influence Louis's personal life and his understanding of love and power. His mother, Queen Anne, a woman of deep religious conviction and Spanish heritage, had a bond with her chief minister, Cardinal Mazarin, that was incredibly close. Mazarin was a powerful, charming and immensely wealthy Italian who had been the protégé of the late Cardinal Richelieu. He was the de facto ruler of France during Louis's minority, and you can sense the young king's resentment. Louis was technically the king, but Mazarin was the one pulling all the strings, the one his mother trusted implicitly. The public, and indeed many at court, believed their relationship was more than professional, that they were secretly married. There's no definitive proof, but their intense, lifelong devotion to one another was a subject of endless gossip. You can imagine the tension in the room. A young boy, raised to believe in his divine right, watching a cardinal, a man who was not his father, hold his mother's undivided attention and wield the power that should be his own. This created a very complicated and competitive dynamic for Louis. He admired Mazarin's political genius, but resented his intimacy with his mother and his control over the kingdom. He saw Mazarin not just as a mentor, but as a rival for his mother's affection and for his own power. This psychological wrestling match would shape his future relationships with women. He would learn to be attracted to women who were powerful, intelligent, and influential. But he would also be wary of their power, always needing to be the one in control, the centre of their universe. This early, complex triangle of Queen Anne, Cardinal Mazarin, and young Louis would be the template for many of his adult affairs. He learned to crave control, to demand loyalty, and to view relationships not just as matters of the heart, but as extensions of his political power. He learned that to be loved was to be respected, and to be respected you had to be feared. The lessons from this childhood crucible were harsh, and they would ultimately forge the Sun King. As Louis grew, the shadow of the Fronde loomed large, but it was the constant presence of Cardinal Mazarin that defined the more intimate landscape of his youth. The relationship between his mother, Anne of Austria, and the cardinal was a fascinating, and for the young king, deeply frustrating spectacle. Imagine being a teenager, a supposed king, and watching your mother, a devoutly Catholic and fiercely proud woman, lavish all her trust and affection on her chief minister. You see her defer to him, lean on his counsel, and treat him with a warmth that you, her own son, feel is rightfully yours. This isn't just a simple case of a child's jealousy. It's the future king of France feeling outmanoeuvred and sidelined by a man who, by all accounts, was brilliant, but also not of their blood. The court was a buzzing hive of speculation. Was their bond purely political, or was there a deeper, more romantic connection? The whispers were everywhere, and they undoubtedly reached Louis's ears. It's a mainstream historical fact that Mazarin was the single most powerful figure in the kingdom, and his influence over Queen Anne was absolute. They corresponded constantly, their letters filled with a blend of political strategy and personal intimacy that has led generations of historians to wonder about the true nature of their relationship. Historians still argue whether Anne of Austria and Mazarin were secretly married. The evidence is circumstantial, letters of affection, the cardinal's immense influence, and the sheer closeness of their bond. But it's not conclusive. Some scholars believe a morganatic marriage, one in which the queen could keep her royal status and the cardinal wouldn't become king, was entirely plausible. For young Louis, this would have been a profoundly disorienting thought. The man who was his rival for his mother's love might also, in some hidden way, be his stepfather. This dynamic created an intense, almost Freudian tension. Louis was raised on the concept of divine right, a king ordained by God, yet here he was, a puppet on a string pulled by a cardinal. You can feel his silent frustration, the simmering resentment that would eventually manifest as a profound need for control. He learned to play a long game, to wait and watch, to appear compliant while all the while building up a fierce determination to one day be the sole arbiter of power in France. He would listen to his mother and Mazarin, he would learn from their political shrewdness, but he would also mentally note every instance of his own powerlessness. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this period is the role of Mazarin's nieces, the Mazarinettes. The cardinal, a man with no legitimate heir, brought several of his nieces to court, intending to marry them off to powerful French nobles and further cement his family's influence. These young women, including the beautiful and spirited Olympe and Hortense Mancini, became fixtures at court. You can picture the scene: a gaggle of Italian-born girls speaking French with a delightful accent, injecting a new energy into the staid French court. For the young Louis, these girls were a fascinating diversion, a chance to interact with women his own age in a way that wasn't constrained by the usual French etiquette. His first real infatuation, his first taste of romance, was with one of them, Olympe Mancini. He was smitten. This was not a political alliance, but a genuine youthful crush, and it drove his mother, Anne and Mazarin, to distraction. The romance between the young king and Olympe was a significant development, but it was not to last. Mazarin, as powerful as he was, knew his time was limited and his position was precarious. He couldn't afford to have the young king marry a commoner, no matter how lovely or well-connected she was. The French nobility would never stand for it. His power was built on a razor's edge, and he knew a marriage to one of his nieces would be a bridge too far, inviting a storm of protest. This is a mainstream historical fact. Mazarin was the one who ultimately put a stop to the match. He had to be cruel to be kind, or at least to be politically savvy. He lectured the young king, reminding him of his duty to France and the need for a politically advantageous marriage. For Louis, it was another painful lesson in the brutal reality of kingship. Love was a luxury, a distraction, and it could, and would, be sacrificed on the altar of statecraft. You can almost feel the heartbreak and the humiliation. Louis was a king, but he couldn't even choose his own wife. He was forced to watch as Mazarin, the man who had controlled his kingdom and his mother, now controlled his heart. He was eventually made to agree to a political marriage with his cousin, Maria Theresa of Spain, a union designed to secure peace between France and Spain. This was the final, devastating blow of Mazarin's tutelage. It was a clear message that Louis's personal desires were secondary to the needs of the state. This experience, however, also taught Louis a crucial lesson about power and its seductive nature. He learned that while he might have to make a public show of deference and duty, his private life was something he could and would control. If his official marriage was a matter of state, then his love affairs, his private passions, would be a realm where he was truly, unequivocally the king. This is where the spicy part of his life really begins. The stage was being set for a reign where politics and passion would be inextricably linked, where the official court would be a theatre of duty and the private apartments a stage for his desires. The relationship with Mazarin, though difficult, was also a masterclass in governance. Louis watched and learned from the cardinal's every move. He saw how Mazarin managed a complex web of alliances, how he outmanoeuvred his enemies, and how he accumulated a personal fortune that was the envy of every noble in France. Louis, who was still officially a child, had a front-row seat to the best and most ruthless political education in Europe. Mazarin's legacy wasn't just in his political savvy, but in the psychological imprint he left on the young king. He taught Louis how to be a ruler, but in doing so, he also inadvertently created a man who was deeply suspicious of anyone who might wield too much influence over him. And so, as the curtain falls on Louis's minority, you see a young man who is not just a king, but a complex tapestry of conflicting emotions. He is a king who has been humiliated by his own people, sidelined by his mother's favourite, and forbidden from loving the woman he desired. He's a man who is ready to take the reins of power, not just to rule a kingdom, but to reclaim his own sense of self-worth and autonomy. The days of being a child king are over. The days of the Sun King are about to begin, and he will bring with him the lessons he learned in the shadow of his mother's lover. The court is about to become a place where lust and ambition are not just tolerated, but celebrated, all under the watchful, vengeful eye of a king who learned the hard way that power is the ultimate aphrodisiac. The Louvre, for all its official grandeur, is about to become a very spicy place indeed. With Mazarin's death in 1661, the complex web of power and affection that had defined Louis's youth was abruptly severed. You can feel the change in the air, a sudden silence where there had been constant buzzing intrigue. The king, now 22 years old, had watched his mentor and rival pass away. The day after, you can imagine the senior ministers gathering expecting Louis to appoint a new chief minister. He looks at them, his face impassive, and says, "I will be my own chief minister." It's a statement that sends a ripple of shock and disbelief through the court. This is not the timid boy who once hid from a mob. This is a man ready to seize the power that he has long been denied. This is the moment the Sun King truly rises. The Louvre, where the court still resided, became the epicenter of this new era. You can picture it. A sprawling, chaotic palace, a labyrinth of grand halls and secret passages, teeming with nobles, courtiers and servants. It was the heart of France, and it was also a place of breathtaking carnal delights. This is where Louis, now free from Mazarin's political and moral tutelage, truly began to explore his own desires. The court was less a place of government, and more a stage for a perpetual high-stakes drama of love, lust and social climbing. Louis's arranged marriage to Maria Theresa of Spain was a political success, solidifying the peace treaty between France and Spain. But as a personal relationship, it was a bit of a snooze fest. Maria Theresa was a quiet, pious woman, deeply in love with her husband but lacking the wit and fire that Louis was beginning to crave. She was a dutiful queen, the mother of his legitimate children, but she was never the object of his passionate affection. This is a mainstream historical fact. Their marriage was one of convenience, and Louis felt little guilt about seeking companionship and intimacy elsewhere. To be a king, in his mind, was to be a man of great appetites, and to deny them would be to deny his very nature. The court of the Louvre in the early 1660s was a playground for the senses. You see the nobles, their silks and satins rustling, their powdered wigs swaying as they engage in witty conversation and scandalous gossip. The air is thick with the scent of perfume, sweat and ambition. This was a world where a woman's virtue was often a strategic resource, to be used to gain favour, influence or wealth. It's easy to look back with modern eyes and judge, but for them, this was the way the game was played. To be noticed by the king was to secure your family's future. To fall from his favour was to face social ruin. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this period revolves around the use of cosmetics and perfume. The nobles of this era were obsessed with elaborate powders and fragrances, but not just for vanity. Many of the ingredients were quite exotic and sometimes dangerous. For example, some perfumes contained civet, a substance derived from the anal glands of the civet cat. The powerful musky scent was highly prized. Imagine walking through a crowded salon, a whirlwind of sweet florals and sharp animal musk filling your nostrils. It's a sensory detail that reminds you of how different this world truly was. A world where the line between elegance and the animalistic was much thinner than we might imagine. This environment of open seduction and political manoeuvring was the perfect training ground for Louis. He was a handsome man with an imposing presence and an undeniable charisma. He moved through the court with a regal grace, his every gesture a reminder of his absolute power. Women were drawn to him not just for his status, but for his vitality and confidence. For Louis, these affairs weren't just about physical pleasure, they were a way of asserting his dominance and control. To have a woman's devotion was to possess her body and soul, and to be the ultimate arbiter of her social standing. His first significant mistress was Catherine de Beauvais, a woman a bit older than him, who had served as a chambermaid to his mother. Their relationship was brief, a youthful dalliance, but it was significant. It was a physical awakening for the young king, a moment where he truly began to see himself as a man, separate from his mother's influence and Mazarin's control. After Catherine, there were other casual affairs, each one a step in his journey of self-discovery. Historians still argue whether these early dalliances were purely expressions of youthful lust or calculated political moves. Some scholars believe Louis, having seen how Mazarin used women like his nieces to build political capital, was consciously using his own romantic pursuits to reward loyalty and punish dissent. Others argue that he was simply a young man, finally free, and indulging in his natural desires. The truth is likely a blend of both. For Louis, every action, even in his private life, had a public and political dimension. He was a king, and a king's passions were never truly private. This is the key to understanding Louis XIV's spicy sex life. It was not a series of disconnected flings. It was an integral part of his political strategy. He saw his court as a grand mechanism, and his love affairs were one of its most powerful gears. By bestowing favour and attention on a mistress, he could elevate her family and humiliate her rivals. He could create a new power structure that was entirely dependent on him, bypassing the old established nobility. This was the genius of Louis XIV. He understood that to control the state, he had to control the hearts and minds of the people within it, and that included their lusts and their ambitions. And so, you see the court of the Louvre as a kind of grand experiment in social engineering. Everyone is watching everyone else. The gossip is a kind of currency, and the king's eye is the ultimate prize. Louis, at the centre of it all, is not just a king, but a master puppeteer. He is learning to manipulate people not through brute force, but through a combination of charm, flattery, and the intoxicating promise of his favour. He's building a new kind of kingdom, one where the old rules of lineage and birthright are still important, but the new rules of royal attention and personal favour are even more so. This is the environment that will produce his first great love, a woman who will be a perfect blend of innocence and ambition, and whose story will be the first great romance of his reign. But that's a story for the next section. For now, just lie there and imagine the scene. The clinking of glasses, the rustling of silks, the murmur of 1,000 secrets, all revolving around a young king who is finally truly in charge. The stage is set, the players are in place, and the young Sun King is ready to take his rightful place at the centre of the universe. The year is now 1661, and Louis XIV has declared that he will rule without a chief minister. He's 22 years old, handsome, vibrant, and burning with a desire to prove his power. This isn't just about political governance. It's about a young man, finally free from the constraints of his mother and Mazarin, exploring what it truly means to be a king. And for Louis, this meant indulging in his first significant affairs, blurring the lines between love and statecraft in a way that would become his trademark. His official duty was to his queen, Maria Theresa, a woman who, while gentle and pious, offered little intellectual or amorous stimulation. She fulfilled her role as queen and mother, but Louis's restless spirit and voracious appetite for life demanded more. This is a mainstream historical fact. Royal marriages of the era were almost exclusively political alliances, and it was widely accepted that a king would take mistresses. It was almost expected. It was a way for a king to reward loyalty, build new networks of influence, and project an image of power and vitality. One of his first major mistresses was Marie Mancini, one of the Mazarinettes, and a woman he'd been forbidden to marry. The sting of that rejection had never fully left him, and their affair was a brief, passionate reignition of a flame that had been forcibly extinguished. It was a way for him to reclaim what he had been denied, a small rebellion against the memory of his former tutor. But Marie, unlike her more ambitious sisters, was not built for the cutthroat world of the French court. She was a romantic, and Louis, for all his fire, was a pragmatist. Their affair was passionate but short-lived. This is where you see the real Louis emerge. His first mistress was a fling, a youthful indiscretion. But his first major public affair was different. It was a conscious choice, a blend of genuine attraction and political calculation. His eyes fell upon a woman named Olympe Mancini, another of Mazarin's nieces. She was beautiful, intelligent, and ambitious, a perfect match for a young king on the rise. Their affair was a public secret, a game of winks and nods played out in the halls of the Louvre. He was still very much a young man, revelling in the power of his position, and she was a woman who knew how to use her beauty and wit to her advantage. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this time speaks to the strange, performative nature of court life. It was a widespread practice for courtiers to wear love tokens, ribbons, locks of hair, or small pieces of jewellery from their lovers. Imagine the scene. The king, surrounded by his court, many of whom are wearing visible symbols of their romantic entanglements. It's a bit like a modern-day celebrity wedding, where everyone is trying to subtly outdo each other with their designer outfits. This culture of public displays of affection, even if they were unofficial, made the court a stage for a perpetual romantic drama with the king at its very centre. The affair with Olympe was a way for Louis to assert his newfound independence. He was no longer the boy who had to hide his feelings. He was a king who could openly favour whomever he chose. He would shower her with gifts and attention, and in doing so he would raise her family status and signal to the entire court that he was a man to be reckoned with. This was the genius of Louis's approach. He saw that by controlling the flow of royal favour, he could control the entire social hierarchy. He could create a new nobility, a new power structure, that owed its existence entirely to him. Historians still argue whether Louis's early affairs were a genuine expression of his personal freedom, or a calculated political tool from the very start. Some scholars believe he was simply a young man, enjoying the perks of his position, and that the political implications were a happy byproduct. Others argue that, having learned from Mazarin, Louis was a shrewd operator from the get-go, using his personal life to serve his political ends. The truth is likely somewhere in the middle. The two were probably indistinguishable for him. For a king, especially one as obsessed with control as Louis, the personal was always political. His affairs were also a way to distract the nobles from their own political ambitions. As long as they were focused on who the king was sleeping with, who was in favour, and who was in disgrace, they were less likely to be plotting against him. He was a master of misdirection, a puppeteer using his own heart as a tool to keep the strings taut. You can sense the atmosphere in the Louvre at this time. It's vibrant, exciting, and filled with a sense of possibility. The old guard, the nobles who had challenged him during the Fronde, are still there, but they are now a bit more circumspect. They know they are dealing with a new kind of king, a king who is not afraid to use his personal life as a weapon. Louis, for his part, is a blur of activity. He is not just a lover, he is also an energetic administrator, holding meetings, overseeing projects, and slowly but surely centralising all power in his own hands. One of his first major administrative projects was to take over the finance ministry. The finance minister, Nicolas Fouquet, had been a key figure under Mazarin, and he was immensely wealthy, living in a palace that rivaled the king's own. Fouquet, believing he had the king's favour, threw a lavish party at his estate, Vaux-le-Vicomte, to honour Louis. The spectacle was breathtaking, with fountains, fireworks, and a feast that was the talk of Europe. But for Louis, it was a step too far. Fouquet's wealth and ostentation were a direct challenge to the king's authority. Louis had him arrested, tried for embezzlement, and imprisoned for life. This is a mainstream historical fact, and it served as a brutal and effective warning to the entire nobility. No one, no matter how rich or powerful, would be allowed to outshine the king. The message was clear. There is only one sun in the French sky, and it is me. This event, the downfall of Fouquet, shows you the cold, calculating side of Louis that lay beneath the charming exterior. He could be a passionate lover, but he was also a ruthless ruler. He was learning to balance the two sides of his personality, using his charisma to charm and his authority to crush. It's a potent combination, and it makes him an incredibly compelling figure. So, as we move into the next phase of Louis's life, you can see a man who is not just a king, but a man on a mission. A mission to consolidate power, to prove his worth, and to live a life of such grandeur and influence that no one would ever dare challenge him again. He's about to meet a woman who will become his first great love, a woman who is the antithesis of the courtly ambition he has seen all around him. A woman whose simple devotion will touch a part of his heart that his political machinations could not. With the court firmly under his control and his personal life now a clear extension of his political power, Louis was a man on the move. He had already demonstrated a flair for ruthless administration with the downfall of Fouquet, and he had flexed his muscles in the romantic arena with a series of public, though not deeply emotional affairs. But what happens when the king, the ultimate pragmatist, falls genuinely in love? What happens when a pure heart and an unassuming spirit capture the attention of a man who has grown up surrounded by artifice and ambition? In 1661, you find yourself at the Château de Saint-Germain-en-Laye, a royal hunting lodge where the court often retreated. The air is crisp, the dogs are barking, and the rustle of silks and satins is a constant counterpoint to the sounds of the chase. Here, you meet a young woman named Françoise Louise de la Baume-le-Blanc, known to everyone as Louise de la Vallière. She's a lady-in-waiting to the king's sister-in-law, a quiet, almost shy figure who is the very opposite of the flamboyant, sharp-tongued women who typically populated the court. She has no grand ambition, no powerful family to back her, and no ruthless agenda. She's just a gentle, sweet-natured girl who has the misfortune, or the good fortune, depending on how you look at it, of catching the king's eye. This is a mainstream historical fact. Louise de la Vallière was Louis XIV's first great love. It was a romance born not of political necessity or social climbing, but of a genuine, overwhelming attraction. You can imagine Louis, tired of the endless posturing and political games, finding a moment of peace and sincerity in the company of this unassuming girl. She didn't chase him, she didn't flatter him with witty remarks or try to outmaneuver her rivals. Her devotion was simple and pure, and for a king who had only ever known conditional love, it was a breath of fresh air. Their courtship was initially clandestine. a delicious secret in a world where nothing was ever truly private. You can picture them, meeting in a hidden garden, exchanging notes, the thrill of their forbidden love a sharp contrast to the very public, very boring royal marriage. Louise, with her quiet beauty and her deep, soulful eyes, became a refuge for Louis. He would confide in her, share his dreams and his burdens, and in her presence, he could drop the heavy mask of the Sun King and simply be Louis. For a brief shining period, their relationship was a classic tale of forbidden love, a king and a commoner united by a love that transcended status and courtly protocol. The public, of course, was not ignorant of the affair for long. A quirky fringe tidbit from this time is that the king's affair was often a topic of popular song and verse, circulated in Paris and around the court. These little poems, often satirical and sometimes quite explicit, would celebrate the king's new love, or mock the queen for her cuckoldry. Imagine that. The king's private life, a matter of public entertainment. It shows you the blurred line between public and private, and the insatiable appetite of the French public for royal gossip. Their romance, however, couldn't stay secret forever. As the affair became more public, Louise found herself in an impossible position. She was a deeply religious woman, tormented by the sin of her relationship with a married man. Her conscience was in constant turmoil. You can feel her internal conflict. On one hand, the overwhelming love for the king, on the other, the profound guilt and the fear of divine punishment. She even attempted to flee the court and take refuge in a convent, a desperate act that highlights the sincerity of her faith and the depth of her moral struggle. Louis, however, would not let her go. He rode to the convent himself, and in a moment of emotional blackmail that was both romantic and utterly ruthless, demanded her return. She, unable to refuse her king and her lover, came back. This public confirmation of their love was a game-changer. It forced Louise into a new role, that of the official royal mistress. Louis, in a move that was both an act of love and a public statement of his power, gave her new titles and estates. He had children with her, recognizing them and giving them a place at court. For a time, Louise was the most envied and, by some, the most pitied woman in France. She had the king's heart, but she also had the constant withering scorn of the queen and the relentless jealousy of every other woman at court. Historians still argue whether Louise's devotion was truly as simple and pure as it appears, or if she was a shrewd operator who played the part of the innocent to great effect. Some scholars believe she was a masterful manipulator, using her apparent piety and shyness to make the king feel safe and adored. Others argue that she was a genuine victim of circumstance, a woman whose true love was both her greatest joy and her greatest sorrow. The truth is likely a blend of both. You don't survive long at the court of Louis XIV without a bit of steel in your spine, and Louise, for all her gentleness, must have had some of that steel to endure what she did. But as with all great romances, this one had a dark underbelly. The very public nature of their affair created a new dynamic at court. The women who were not favoured by the king were now in a position to be humiliated. The queen, Maria Theresa, had to endure the constant presence of her husband's mistress, a woman who bore him children and who was showered with gifts and affection. You can feel the quiet, burning shame and sadness of the queen, a woman whose dignity was a constant casualty of her husband's passions. And then there was the rivalry. While Louise was a gentle and unassuming soul, the court was full of ambitious women who saw her as an obstacle. They would gossip, plot, and try to undermine her at every turn. Louise, with her quiet nature, was ill-equipped to handle this onslaught. She was a flower in a field of thorns, and her time in the sun, for all its glory, was destined to be short-lived. Louis, for his part, was beginning to grow restless. The pure devotion that had once been so intoxicating was beginning to feel a bit boring. He was a man who thrived on a challenge, and Louise offered none. He was ready for a new chapter, a new romance, one with more fire, more wit, and a lot more drama. The quiet devotion of Louise was a beautiful thing, but a man who saw himself as the Sun King was always going to crave a brighter, more spectacular star. As the sun begins to set on the quiet devotion of Louise de la Vallière, a new, more dazzling star is rising at the court. The king, a man of endless vitality and a taste for the theatrical, was beginning to find Louise's gentle nature a bit, well, boring. He was the Sun King, a man who thrived on drama and spectacle, and Louise was a calm, gentle moon. He needed a firecracker, a woman whose wit was as sharp as her ambition, and whose beauty was as formidable as her spirit. He found her in the form of Françoise Athénise de Rochechouart de Mortemart, better known to history as the Marquise de Montespan. You can almost feel the shift in the court's atmosphere as Montespan makes her move. She's a member of one of the oldest and most distinguished noble families in France, and she's not just beautiful, she's a force of nature. Witty, charismatic, and with a tongue that could cut a man to ribbons, she was the polar opposite of the demure Louise. This is a mainstream historical fact. The rivalry between Montespan and La Vallière was one of the most famous and public spectacles of Louis XIV's early reign. It was a clash of two very different worlds, the quiet devotion of the old mistress versus the bold, unapologetic ambition of the new. The initial stages of this rivalry were a masterclass in social manoeuvring. Montespan, with her powerful family connections and her razor-sharp intellect, began to subtly undermine Louise. She became a close friend of the Queen, a move that was both strategic and deliciously ironic. While Montespan was pretending to comfort the long-suffering Maria Theresa, she was also getting closer to the king, making herself an indispensable part of his inner circle. You can picture the scene, the three of them, the king, the queen, and Montespan, sitting together, while Louise, the official mistress, is pushed to the side, a silent, heartbroken witness to her own slow-motion replacement. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this era reveals the incredible lengths to which Montespan went to secure her position. It was said that she would have her servants create a series of accidental encounters with the king, ensuring she was always in his line of sight, always at the centre of attention. She would also strategically deploy her wit and charm, engaging him in conversations about art, politics and literature, things that the gentle Louise had little interest in. She wasn't just vying for his affection, she was vying for his mind. For Louis, a man who saw himself as a patron of the arts and a brilliant statesman, this was an irresistible combination. The public competition between the two women was a subject of endless gossip and speculation. Pamphlets, plays, and satirical poems were written about the Montespan vs. La Vallière showdown. Imagine going to the theatre and seeing a thinly veiled play about the king's love life, with the audience roaring with laughter and applause. It was a bizarre public spectacle, and Louis, for his part, seemed to relish it. For a man who had been humiliated by the public during the Fronde, this was a form of control. He was no longer the subject of rebellious riots. He was the main character in the nation's favourite soap opera, and he was writing the script. Historians still argue whether Montespan's ascendancy was a result of her own brilliant scheming, or if Louis, in his restless boredom, was actively seeking a replacement for Louise. Some scholars believe that Louis was a willing participant in the game, a man who found the drama of the rivalry more exciting than the quiet comfort of his old love. Others argue that Montespan was a singular force of nature, a woman so formidable that even the Sun King couldn't resist her pull. The truth, as always, is likely a blend of both. Louis was a man who craved excitement, and Montespan was a woman who was a walking, talking fireworks show. It was a match made in a very scandalous heaven. As Montespan's star rose, Louise's fell. You can feel the profound sadness of her situation. She had loved the king with a pure heart, and in return she was now being slowly, publicly, and cruelly replaced. She was still living at court, still a mother to the king's children, but her position was no longer one of love. It was a position of humiliation. Louis, in a moment of utter thoughtlessness, even had Montespan appointed as one of the queen's ladies-in-waiting, forcing the two rivals to live in a state of constant, awkward proximity. The cruelty of this situation is almost unbearable. You can only imagine the whispered insults, the cold stares, and the profound sense of betrayal that Louise must have felt. But Louise, for all her gentleness, had a quiet dignity. She had given the king her love, and she had borne him children. She knew her time was over, but she refused to be humiliated further. In a move that was both a testament to her faith and a final act of rebellion, she chose to leave the court. She retired to a Carmelite convent where she would live the rest of her life as a nun, dedicating her days to prayer and repentance. It was a dramatic exit, a final poignant act that solidified her place in history as the tragic, heartbroken mistress. Her departure left the field wide open for Montespan. With Louise gone, Montespan became the official royal mistress, the titular mistress as they called it. She was now the sun around which the court revolved, second only to the king himself. She was given her own apartments at the newly constructed Palace of Versailles, a place that was being built as a grand stage for Louis's reign. She was the one who was now showered with jewels, gifts and titles. She was the one who bore the king's children, and she was the one who held immense sway over his heart and his decisions. The rise of Montespan was not just a personal victory, it was a political one. She used her position to help her family and her allies, becoming a powerful force in her own right. She was a woman who understood that in the world of Louis XIV, love was just another form of power, and she was a master of wielding it. She was the perfect consort for the Sun King, a woman who was as theatrical, as ambitious, and as unapologetically grand as he was. But as we know, in the world of Louis XIV, the higher you rise, the harder you fall. And Montespan, for all her brilliance, was about to find herself in the middle of a scandal so dark, so sinister, that it would threaten to consume her and the very foundations of the court. The stage is set for a new kind of drama, one that moves from the bright lights of the court into the whispering shadows of a world of sorcery and poison. As Montespan's star ascended, so too did the dust and noise of a sprawling, ambitious construction site just outside Paris. While Louis was managing his complex and very public love life, he was also undertaking a project of unprecedented scale and audacity, the transformation of a small hunting lodge into the magnificent Palace of Versailles. You can almost hear the rhythmic clanging of hammers, the shouting of foremen, and the rumble of stone being hauled into place. This is a mainstream historical fact. Versailles was built to glorify Louis XIV and to serve as the physical embodiment of his absolute power. It was a project born of the king's childhood trauma and his desire to control his nobles. Remember that feeling of a 10-year-old boy hiding in his bed while a mob of angry Parisians stormed the palace? That humiliation never left him. He hated Paris and its fickle, rebellious populace. He wanted a seat of power that was far enough away to be safe, but close enough to be in command. Versailles was his answer. It was a blank canvas, a place where he could build a new kind of court, a new kind of kingdom, and a new kind of social order. It was a gilded cage designed to contain his restless and ambitious nobles. Instead of allowing the aristocracy to stay on their provincial estates, where they could build up their own power bases and potentially plot against the crown, Louis insisted that they live at Versailles. You can picture it, a constant, unending performance of court life. The nobles, once proud and independent lords, were now reduced to courtiers, vying for the king's attention, a smile, a kind word. Their lives became a perpetual cycle of ceremony, gossip, and endless costly fashion. Their energy, their money, and their time were all spent on this elaborate spectacle, leaving them little room for political rebellion. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this period is the incredibly elaborate system of court etiquette that Louis created. Everything, from a noble's place at the dinner table to the exact way they were to bow, was meticulously choreographed. There was even a specific hierarchy for who was allowed to knock on a king's door. The highest-ranking nobles were allowed to use their knuckles, while the lower-ranking ones had to use their pinky finger. Imagine the subtle, silent power plays that went on, the small gestures that could signify a rise or fall in a noble's status. It was a brilliant theatrical way to turn the entire nobility into a group of eager-to-please students, all under the watchful eye of their ultimate master. The construction of Versailles was also a very public statement about the king's virility and his passions. As the palace grew, so too did the number of his mistresses and his children. Montespan, now the official royal mistress, was given a prominent place in the new palace. Her apartments were often right next to the king's, a physical manifestation of her power. She was a woman who was a perfect match for the grandeur of the project. She saw herself as a queen in all but name, and she used her position to help shape the artistic and architectural direction of the palace. It was a grand stage for a grand love affair, and Montespan was more than happy to play the leading lady. Historians still argue whether Versailles was a brilliant political masterstroke or an act of monumental ego that ultimately bankrupted the country. Some scholars argue that by centralising the nobility and keeping them occupied with courtly life, Louis prevented another Fronde, ensuring centuries of stability for the French monarchy. Others argue that the immense cost of the palace, both in money and in the erosion of regional power, ultimately weakened France and sowed the seeds for the French Revolution over a century later. The truth is likely somewhere in between. It was an act of pure genius and pure hubris, all rolled into one. The palace was not just a symbol of political power, it was also a reflection of the king's spicy personal life. The elaborate gardens, with their hidden groves and secret fountains, were often the sites of clandestine meetings and romantic rendezvous. The Hall of Mirrors, with its breathtaking opulence, was a stage for extravagant parties and theatrical performances that often celebrated the king's conquests, both military and romantic. Versailles was, in essence, a giant, beautiful and very expensive monument to Louis XIV's all-encompassing desires. This period was a time of immense energy and creativity for Louis. He was a man who saw no separation between his public and private life. The building of Versailles, his military campaigns, his love affairs, they were all part of the same grand, spectacular performance. He was not just a king, he was an artist, a director, and a star, and the entire nation was his stage. He was building a legacy that would be talked about for centuries, and he was doing it with a breathtaking, almost reckless confidence. But as the palace grew, so too did the number of people who were hurt by its existence. The people who were forced to work on the project in terrible conditions, the nobles who were stripped of their power and independence, and the women who were caught in the king's complicated web of love and lust. Louise de la Vallière, for all her quiet devotion, had been cast aside for a flashier model. Queen Maria Theresa was still the official queen, but her life was a constant state of humiliation. And Montespan, for all her power, was beginning to feel the weight of her position. The king's affections, once so intoxicating, were as fickle as the wind, and a woman who had fought so hard to be the centre of his universe knew that she could just as easily be replaced. As Versailles rose from the marshlands, it was a testament to the king's immense power and his personal passions. It was a palace that was both a triumph of architecture and a monument to human vanity. It was a place where love and lust were inextricably linked with power and politics. It was the perfect backdrop for the rest of Louis XIV's reign, a reign that would be filled with incredible highs and some truly devastating lows. The drama of the court, a drama that Louis had orchestrated with such precision, was just getting started. And with a palace as grand as Versailles, there was more than enough room for everyone to have a role. With the grandeur of Versailles rising from the ground, the court became a permanent and theatrical stage for Louis's reign, and his passions were its main performance. He was no longer just a king, he was a master of ceremony, and every aspect of his life, from his military campaigns to his romantic entanglements, was an elaborate show. The court was a constant whirlwind of elaborate rituals and entertainments, all of which served as a backdrop for the increasingly complex love life of the Sun King. The daily life at Versailles was a meticulously choreographed dance. You can picture the Lever du Roi, the King's Awakening, where a select group of nobles was allowed to watch him get dressed. This wasn't just a simple act of getting out of bed. It was a sacred ritual, a public affirmation of the king's divine status. Being allowed to hand the king his shirt was an immense honour, a sign of your place in the social hierarchy. These rituals, from the king's dressing to his dining, were all designed to create an aura of untouchable majesty, and they all served as a backdrop for the court's relentless gossip and intrigue. This is a mainstream historical fact. Louis XIV's court life was a powerful tool of social and political control. By creating a system where every aspect of a noble's life was centred around the king, Louis ensured that they were too busy competing for his favour to plot against him. The real power lay not in their ancestral lands, but in their proximity to the king. A new kind of currency was being minted at Versailles, and its value was measured in the king's smiles, his attention, and his fleeting passions. Amidst this glittering spectacle, Montespan reigned as the Sun King's mistress. Her ascendancy was total. She was given magnificent apartments, a retinue of servants, and an immense fortune. She became the unofficial queen of the court, a woman whose influence was felt in every corner of the kingdom. She was beautiful, witty, and intelligent, a perfect match for the king's charisma. She was not just a mistress. She was his confidant, his partner in all things, and a powerful force in her own right. You can feel the sheer confidence and power she exuded as she moved through the Hall of Mirrors, the court bowing and whispering in her wake. A quirky fringe tidbit from this period is the role of the king's private carriages. The carriages were often a site of intense political and romantic jockeying. Being invited to ride in the king's carriage was a sign of immense favour, a moment of intimacy and access that could make or break a courtier's career. Montespan, of course, was a constant fixture in the king's carriage, a public symbol of her power and her hold over his heart. It was a theatrical way for Louis to announce his preferences to the entire world, and Montespan, for her part, was more than happy to be a part of the show. The king's grand passions, however, were not limited to a single woman. Louis, for all his devotion to Montespan, was a man of immense appetites. While Montespan was the official titular mistress, he had other more casual affairs. There were moments of jealousy and drama, of course, but for the most part Montespan had learned to tolerate these dalliances as long as she remained the preeminent favourite. She was the one who had his heart, she believed, and the others were just fleeting distractions. But as we know, in the world of Louis XIV, a fleeting distraction could quickly become a serious threat. Historians still argue whether Montespan's dominance was a result of a genuine, deep love between her and the king, or if it was more a political partnership. Some scholars believe that Louis, having grown bored of the simple devotion of Louise de la Vallière, found a true intellectual and emotional equal in Montespan. She could talk to him about art, politics, and the affairs of the state in a way that no other woman could. Others argue that she was simply a brilliant social climber who used her beauty and her wit to secure a position of immense power. The truth is likely a blend of both. They were a powerful, charismatic couple who, for a time, were a perfect match for each other, a king and a queen who were in charge of both the kingdom and the court's social life. The entertainments at Versailles were designed to celebrate this powerful, vibrant court. There were grand hunting parties, elaborate masquerade balls, and theatrical performances that were often written by the king's favourite playwrights, like Molière. These events were not just for fun, they were a way for Louis to project an image of a kingdom that was rich, powerful, and culturally advanced. He was building a new kind of empire, an empire of style and sophistication, and he was using his court and his mistresses to be its public face. But as the court grew in its theatricality, so too did its underbelly. The same system of patronage and favouritism that Montespan used to rise to power could also be used to undermine others. The court was a hotbed of whispers, rumours, and intrigue, and Montespan herself was not immune to its dangers. She had made many enemies on her way to the top, and they were all watching and waiting for her to make a single mistake. The Sun King's court, for all its light and beauty, was a place of deep shadows and dark secrets, and as the king's eye began to wander, as it inevitably did, Montespan began to feel a sense of unease. The power she had so carefully constructed was built on a foundation of his fleeting affection, and that foundation was beginning to show cracks. She was a woman who had mastered the art of the court, but she was now facing a new kind of threat, one that was not from a rival mistress, but from the king's own restlessness. She was about to learn a lesson that every courtier, every mistress, and every noble at Versailles would have to learn eventually. The Sun King's light, for all its warmth, could also burn you. The stage was set for her downfall, a fall that would be as spectacular and as public as her rise, and it would be a fall that would be inextricably linked with one of the darkest scandals in French history. For over a decade, Montespan reigned as the Sun King's official mistress, the glittering star at the centre of the Versailles firmament. She was not just a passing fancy, she was a fixture, a powerful woman who bore Louis 7 children and wielded immense influence over the court and the kingdom. Her apartments were magnificently decorated, a testament to her power and her taste, and she moved through the court with an air of regal confidence that bordered on arrogance. This is a mainstream historical fact. Montespan's time as the maîtresse en titre, official mistress, was a golden age of sorts for both her and the king. She was his intellectual equal, his confidant, and a powerful force in her own right. You can picture them together, Louis, in his prime, a handsome and charismatic king, and Montespan, a stunning beauty, with a wicked wit and an undeniable magnetism. They were a power couple, a theatrical and very public pairing that defined the court of Versailles. Her family, the de Mortemas, were elevated to positions of power and wealth. Her influence was everywhere, from the fashions worn at court to the political appointments made by the king. To be in Montespan's good graces was to be in the king's, and her patronage was sought after by every artist, writer, and courtier in France. But the nature of Louis's love was a double-edged sword. As we've seen, his passions, while intense, were also restless. The very qualities that had attracted him to Montespan, her sharp wit, her ambitious nature, her demand for attention, began to wear on him. He was a man who, at heart, craved control, and Montespan was a woman who was increasingly difficult to control. She was a rival for attention, a queen in all but name, and the Sun King, who saw himself as the centre of the universe, was beginning to find her presence a little too bright. A quirky fringe tidbit from this time is the incredible sums of money Montespan spent on her apartments and her wardrobe. She had a team of architects, designers and jewellers working exclusively for her. It was said that her apartment at Versailles was so lavishly decorated that it rivaled the Queen's, and her wardrobe was a constant parade of the most expensive silks, satins and jewels. This ostentation, while a testament to her power, also created resentment among the other courtiers, and eventually a sense of unease in the king. She was becoming too much, a shadow that was beginning to threaten to eclipse the sun. Historians still argue whether the decline of Montespan's influence was a result of the king's wandering eye or her own increasingly difficult and demanding behaviour. Some scholars believe that Louis was simply growing older and beginning to crave a more quiet, pious life, and that Montespan's flamboyant nature no longer appealed to him. Others argue that she became increasingly jealous and possessive, using her wit as a weapon against the king's new, more casual interests, and that this ultimately pushed him away. The truth is likely a blend of both. Her star was beginning to wane, and in the cutthroat world of Versailles, a star that wanes is a star that's about to fall. The final act of her downfall began not in a rival's arms, but in the dark, whispering world of a secret scandal. The French police, under the king's new, no-nonsense chief of police, were beginning to uncover a clandestine network of fortune-tellers, alchemists, and poisoners in Paris. This wasn't just a simple criminal underworld. It was a dark, dangerous world that catered to the highest echelons of society, and at its centre was a woman named La Voisin, a fortune-teller and purveyor of potions and poisons who had a client list that read like a who's who of the French nobility. The initial investigation was a standard police operation, a crackdown on a criminal enterprise. But as the interrogations continued, the names that began to surface were shocking. Nobles, courtiers, and even some of the king's close friends were implicated in a network of sorcery, poisonings, and black masses. You can feel the sense of dread and horror that must have swept through the court as these whispers turned into public accusations. The Sun King's court, for all its light and beauty, had a dark, festering underbelly. And then came the bombshell. During one of the interrogations, La Voisin's daughter, under duress, began to confess. She spoke of black masses, of rituals involving the sacrifice of infants, and of a woman who had come to her for a love potion, a woman who wanted to secure the king's love and to get rid of her rivals. The name she gave was a name that sent a shockwave through the entire court. Françoise Athénine de Montespan, the woman who had been the king's lover, the mother of his children, was now being accused of sorcery and of attempting to poison her rivals. The very foundations of the court were shaking. This is a mainstream historical fact, known as the Affair of the Poisons. It was a scandal so large and so explosive that it threatened to tear the court apart. The king, in a state of utter disbelief and horror, ordered a secret commission to investigate the matter. The findings were so damning and so close to the throne that Louis was forced to make a difficult decision. He could either pursue the investigation, which would undoubtedly lead to the public disgrace and execution of the mother of his children, or he could bury the scandal. He chose to bury it. The most incriminating documents were sealed away, never to be seen again, and many of the accused, including Montespan's most trusted servants, were secretly executed without trial. The fallout, however, was immense. While Montespan was never officially charged, her name was forever tainted. Her close association with the dark world of poison and sorcery made her a pariah at court. The king, who had once been so passionately in love with her, now looked at her with a mix of disgust and horror. The magic was gone. The love, which had once been so vibrant and so public, was now a source of shame and revulsion. Montespan, for all her power and her wit, had made a mistake that no courtier, no matter how powerful, could ever recover from. She had allowed her ambition to lead her into a world that was too dark, too dangerous, and too close to the throne. Her downfall, while not a public execution, was a slow, painful, and very public humiliation. She would spend the rest of her days at Versailles, a ghost in the very halls where she had once reigned as a queen. The stage was now set for a new kind of mistress, a woman who would bring with her a sense of piety, of quiet devotion, and a sense of calm that the aging king was beginning to crave. The scandal of the affair of the poisons had a chilling effect on the court, and most importantly on the king's private life. The glittering theatrical world of Versailles suddenly had a dark, menacing shadow cast over it. You can feel the change in the atmosphere. The whispers in the corridors were no longer just about love affairs and social standing. They were now about sorcery, black masses and poison. For Louis, a man who believed in the divine right of kings, the idea that his court was steeped in such vile and impious practices was a source of profound disgust and horror. The woman who'd been his great love, the mother of his children, was now tainted by this dark stain, and her downfall was not a matter of a rival's charm, but a matter of a deep moral revulsion on the king's part. The affair is a mainstream historical fact, but its true scope and what Louis knew remains a subject of intense debate. Historians still argue whether Montespan was truly involved in the use of poisons and black masses, or if she was a convenient scapegoat for a scandal that had reached the highest levels of the French nobility. Some scholars argue that the evidence against her, primarily from the testimony of a woman who was a known sorceress and under immense duress, is weak, and that Montespan was simply an ambitious woman who used all the tools available to her, including some of the more unsavoury ones, to hold on to her power. Others believe that the king's swift and total rejection of her and his decision to bury the evidence is proof of her guilt. The truth, sealed away in the king's private archives, is a secret we may never fully uncover. What is undeniable, however, is the impact the scandal had on Louis and his court. It shattered the illusion of a perfect divine court and revealed a world of deep-seated depravity and superstition. Louis, who had always seen himself as the protector of the faith and the arbiter of all things good and true, was deeply shaken. He was a king who had been raised to believe in God, and the idea that his mistress was involved in rituals that involved the devil was an existential crisis for him. He began to turn away from the flamboyant and indulgent lifestyle he had led, and he began to seek out something different, something more serious and more pious. And as Montespan's star waned, a new, quieter figure was slowly rising to prominence. She was not a glamorous noblewoman or a fiery beauty. She was a widow named Françoise d'Aubigné, who had been hired to serve as the governess for the king's illegitimate children with Montespan. This is a quirky fringe tidbit from this time. The king, wanting to distance himself from Montespan, was increasingly drawn to the calm, pious presence of the governess. She was not a part of the courtly intrigue. Her life was one of quiet devotion, prayer, and intellectual pursuits. You can picture her, a woman of intelligence and dignity, a quiet presence in the midst of the court's constant chaos. Her background was not one of privilege. She was born in a prison, the granddaughter of a famous Huguenot military leader, and she had experienced poverty and hardship. She was a woman who had seen the darker side of life, and she had a quiet strength and a deep faith that made her a grounding presence. She was the polar opposite of Montespan in every way, and for Louis, who was now weary of the drama and the scandals, she was an oasis of calm. He began to spend more and more time in her company, not for passion or for lust, but for conversation, for intellectual companionship, and for a sense of peace that he had never found with any of his other lovers. The relationship between Louis and Françoise d'Aubigné, who would later become the Marquise de Maintenon, was a slow burn, a gradual shift from a respectful friendship to a deep and abiding affection. He was no longer a young man in his prime. He was entering middle age, and his priorities were beginning to change. He was still the Sun King, a man of immense appetites and an ego to match, but he was also a man who was beginning to feel the weight of his age and the responsibilities of his kingdom. He was starting to think about his legacy, about his soul, and about the afterlife. He was a man who, after a lifetime of scandal and excess, was beginning to crave a sense of order and spiritual redemption. The affair of the poisons was the catalyst for this change. It was the moment he realized that his court, and his life, was not as perfect and as divine as he had imagined. It was a moment of profound crisis, and in the aftermath, he turned to the one person who seemed to embody everything that his previous life had not: piety, humility, and a quiet sense of grace. Françoise d'Aubigné was not a woman who would ever engage in the courtly intrigues or the cutthroat rivalries. She was a woman who was a comfort to him, a source of quiet strength, and a partner in his spiritual journey. The court, of course, was baffled. They had seen the king fall in and out of love with one beautiful woman after another. but they had never seen him become so deeply attached to a woman who was not a dazzling beauty or a powerful noble. They saw her as a pious boor, a woman who was trying to turn the king into a religious fanatic. They whispered behind her back and called her names, but they underestimated her power. She had something that none of his other mistresses had ever had: the king's respect and his trust. She was not just a lover, she was a spiritual guide, a friend, and a confidant, and her influence over the aging king was about to become total. The era of the fiery, passionate mistress was over. The era of the pious, quiet, and deeply influential companion was just beginning, and it would change the very nature of Versailles and the Sun King forever. The slow but undeniable shift in the king's affections was now complete. The era of the flamboyant, theatrical Montespan was over, replaced by the quiet, intellectual presence of Françoise d'Aubigné. You can feel the court's bewilderment as they watched the Sun King, a man who had been the very embodiment of passion and excess, become deeply attached to his children's governess. She was a widow, a commoner by noble standards, and a woman of profound piety. The fact that she was not a dazzling beauty or a fiery personality was, for Louis, precisely the point. He was a man who had grown weary of the drama and the superficiality of court life, and he was now seeking a deeper, more meaningful connection. This is a mainstream historical fact. Françoise d'Aubigné, who would later be known as Madame de Maintenon, became the king's companion and eventually his second wife. Their relationship began not with a grand passion, but with a quiet, intellectual bond. Louis, a man who had always valued a witty conversation, found in her an equal. She was well-read, articulate, and intelligent, and she was not afraid to challenge him or to offer her opinion. For a king who was surrounded by sycophants, this was an intoxicating and rare quality. He would spend hours in her apartments, not for physical passion, but for conversation, for intellectual companionship, and for a sense of peace that he had never found with his other lovers. Their relationship was a slow burn, a gradual deepening of affection that was almost imperceptible to the court at first. She was a governess, a woman of a lower social standing, and it was unthinkable that the Sun King would ever become romantically involved with her. But as he grew older, and as the affair of the poisons began to weigh on his conscience, he found himself drawn to her piety and her sense of moral rectitude. She was a woman who could offer him not just a comfortable companionship, but a path to spiritual redemption. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this time reveals a very different side of the king's personality. Louis XIV, the man who had been the ultimate womanizer, was now spending his days reading pious books, discussing theology, and even attending religious retreats with Maintenon. You can picture it. The Sun King, a man who had built a palace dedicated to his own glory, was now spending his time in quiet contemplation, a testament to the profound influence this woman had over him. He was a man who was beginning to think about his soul, about his legacy, and about his place in the afterlife, and she was his guide on this journey. Historians still argue whether Maintenon was a genuinely pious woman who led the king toward a more virtuous life, or if she was a clever and subtle manipulator who used her apparent piety to secure a position of immense power. Some scholars believe that she was a woman of deep faith who genuinely loved the king and wanted to help him become a better man. Others argue that she was a master of the long game, a woman who knew that the only way to hold the king's affection was to appeal to his increasingly spiritual side. The truth is likely a blend of both. She was a woman of genuine faith, but she was also a woman who had survived a childhood of poverty and a lifetime of hardship, and she knew how to play the game of power, even if she did so with a quiet, almost imperceptible grace. The court, of course, was deeply resentful of her influence. They saw her as a pious boor, a joy killer who was turning their fun-loving king into a religious fanatic. They nicknamed her Sainte Françoise, and whispered behind her back, but they underestimated her power. She had something that Montespan had never had: the king's respect and his trust. She was not just a lover, she was a spiritual guide, a friend, and a confidant, and her influence over the aging king was about to become total. The relationship between Louis and Maintenon was a turning point, not just for the king's personal life, but for the entire court. The flamboyant, theatrical atmosphere of Versailles began to change. The wild parties and the extravagant balls were replaced by a more sober and pious tone. The king, under Maintenon's influence, became more serious, more focused on the affairs of the state, and more concerned with his own moral rectitude. He was a man who was no longer chasing after fleeting pleasures. He was a man who was thinking about his legacy, about his soul, and about the future of his kingdom. And as their relationship deepened, so too did her influence over the children she had been hired to raise. These were the king's illegitimate children with Montespan, but under Maintenon's guidance they were raised with a sense of piety, of discipline, and of a deep sense of their duty to the crown. She was, in essence, a surrogate mother to them, and her influence over them was profound. This would have a significant impact on the future of the Bourbon dynasty, as these children would eventually play a major role in the affairs of the state. The rise of Maintenon was a powerful lesson for the entire court. It was a lesson that showed that in the end it was not beauty, wit, or power that would win the king's heart, but a quiet, unwavering sense of piety and a deep, abiding intelligence. She was a woman who had survived a lifetime of hardship, and who had used her intellect and her faith to secure a position of immense power and influence. She was the final and most profound chapter in the king's spicy, tumultuous love life. The era of the Grand Mistress was over. The era of the quiet, pious companion had begun, and it would be a chapter that would define the final decades of the Sun King's reign. As the Sun King aged, his life and his court underwent a profound transformation, and at the heart of that change was his deepening relationship with Françoise d'Aubigné, the woman who would become the Marquise de Maintenon. The court, for all its gossip and intrigue, was completely blindsided when, following the death of his queen, Maria Theresa, in 1683, Louis made a decision that was both shocking and unprecedented. He married Maintenon in a secret ceremony. This is a mainstream historical fact. The marriage was morganatic, meaning it didn't give Maintenon the title of queen, or a claim to the throne for any of their children, but it gave her a position of immense and undeniable power. You can imagine the scene. The ceremony was a quiet, private affair, likely held in the dead of night, with only a few trusted confidants in attendance. There were no public pronouncements, no grand celebrations, no parades through the streets of Paris. It was a secret, but a secret of immense importance. For Louis, it was a profound declaration of his love and respect for a woman who had become his intellectual and spiritual equal. For Maintenon, it was the culmination of a life of quiet endurance, a final, unassailable triumph. She was a woman who had been born in a prison and had risen, through her intelligence and her piety, to become the wife of the most powerful man in Europe. The morganatic nature of the marriage was crucial. It allowed Louis to reconcile his duties as a king with his personal desires. He could have a wife he loved and respected without creating a political firestorm. The French nobility, for all their resentment of her influence, could not openly challenge the king's marriage, as it didn't threaten the line of succession. This is a quirky, fringe tidbit. The marriage was so secret that for many years the public was entirely unaware of it. Maintenon simply continued in her role as a courtier, a sort of shadow queen, whose influence was felt everywhere but rarely seen. She was given an apartment next to the king's, a private entrance, and a level of access that no one else at court, not even the highest-ranking nobles, could ever hope to attain. Historians still argue whether Maintenon was truly the king's wife in every sense of the word, or if their marriage was a formality that served as a cover for her immense political influence. Some scholars argue that she was a genuine partner to the king, a woman who offered him advice and counsel on all matters, from politics to theology. They point to the fact that Louis would often work in her apartments, a quiet and private space where he could be himself. Others argue that she was a more subtle and self-serving figure, a woman who used her piety and her influence to become the most powerful woman in France, even if she did so from the shadows. The truth is likely a blend of both. She was a woman of immense power and influence, and she was also a woman who was in love with her husband, a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in her company. The marriage to Maintenon marked the beginning of a new chapter for the king. He was no longer the flamboyant Sun King of his youth. He was now a more serious, more pious, and more introspective monarch. The court, under Maintenon's quiet but firm influence, began to change. The wild parties and the elaborate entertainments were replaced by a more subdued and religious atmosphere. The king, who had once been a symbol of excess, was now a symbol of piety and virtue. This was a profound and lasting transformation, and it was a direct result of Maintenon's influence. Her influence, however, was not limited to the king's personal life. She was a powerful force in the kingdom, using her influence to help her friends and her family. She was a patron of the arts and a founder of a famous school for girls, the Maison Royale de Saint-Louis at Saint-Cyr. This is a mainstream historical fact. The school was a revolutionary institution that provided a high-quality education to girls from impoverished noble families. It was a testament to Maintenon's compassion and her belief in the power of education, and it was a lasting legacy that would long outlive her. The marriage of Louis XIV and Maintenon was a fascinating and complex affair. It was a love story, to be sure, but it was also a story about power, about faith, and about the profound and lasting influence that one person can have on another. She was a woman who had survived a lifetime of hardship, and who had used her intellect, her piety, and her quiet strength to secure a position of immense power and influence. She was the final and most profound chapter in the king's spicy, tumultuous love life. The era of the Grand Mistress was over. The era of the quiet, pious companion had begun, and it would be a chapter that would define the final decades of the Sun King's reign, and it would set the stage for a new kind of court, a court that was less about spectacle and more about piety and faith. But as we know, in the world of Louis XIV, even piety and faith could not protect the kingdom from the ravages of war, or the heartbreaking losses of a dynasty in peril. With Madame de Maintenon at his side, Louis XIV's court began to transform. The flamboyant extravagance that had defined the era of Montespan slowly gave way to a more sombre, devout, and disciplined atmosphere. You can feel the change in the air at Versailles. The wild parties became less frequent. The masquerade balls were replaced by pious religious services, and the king's mistresses, once a very public part of the court, were a thing of the past. The Sun King, a man who had once been the ultimate symbol of earthly indulgence, was now a man who was deeply concerned with his salvation. This is a mainstream historical fact. Under the influence of Maintenon, Louis XIV became a more religious monarch, and this piety had a profound impact on his policies and his personal life. He had always been a Catholic king, but now his faith became a central part of his identity. He began to crack down on immorality at court, demanding a higher standard of behaviour from his nobles. The days of open adultery and scandalous affairs were over. The king's eye was no longer a prize to be won by the most beautiful or the most witty. It was a gaze to be earned through piety, good works, and a devotion to the crown. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this period is the role of the king's confessor. For many years, the king's confessor was a Jesuit priest who had a powerful influence over him. Maintenon, however, was also a spiritual guide to the king, and she would often work in concert with the confessor to steer the king toward a more virtuous path. Imagine the quiet power of these two figures, a woman and a priest whispering in the king's ear, their words shaping not just his soul, but the destiny of an entire kingdom. This triumvirate of power, the king, his wife, and his confessor, was a force that was a testament to the profound shift in the court's atmosphere. The influence of Maintenon was most evident in the king's family life. She was, for all intents and purposes, the king's wife and the stepmother to his children, both legitimate and illegitimate. She had a profound influence over the king's illegitimate children with Montespan, whom she'd raised and whom Louis had now legitimised. They were no longer the forgotten offspring of a scandalous affair. They were princes and princesses of the blood, and under Maintenon's tutelage, they were raised with a sense of piety and duty. This gave her an even greater influence over the royal family and by extension the future of the Bourbon dynasty. Historians still argue whether the king's newfound piety was genuine or a political calculation. Some scholars believe that Louis, having seen the chaos and the scandal of his youth, was genuinely remorseful and wanted to lead a more virtuous life. They point to his deep personal devotion and his increasing obsession with the affairs of the soul. Others argue that his piety was a convenient way to consolidate his power and to create a more disciplined and obedient court. They argue that a court of devout, pious nobles was less likely to rebel than a court of hedonistic and rebellious ones. The truth is likely a blend of both. Louis was a man who saw no separation between his personal life and his political life, and his newfound piety served both his soul and his state. The most profound and lasting impact of this shift, however, was the king's revocation of the Edict of Nantes in 1685. This is a mainstream historical fact. The edict had granted French Protestants, Huguenots, religious freedoms and protections. Its revocation, under the influence of his Catholic wife and his Jesuit confessor, was a devastating blow to the Huguenots. It led to the persecution and the forced conversion of thousands of Protestants, and it caused over 100,000 Huguenots to flee the country, taking their skills, their wealth, and their knowledge with them. This was a move that was deeply rooted in the king's newfound piety, and it had a catastrophic impact on the French economy and on its international reputation. The court of Versailles, once a symbol of opulence and artistic freedom, was now a place of religious orthodoxy and rigid morality. The king, under Maintenon's influence, became a stern and unforgiving monarch. He was no longer the charming and charismatic young man who had once been the talk of Europe. He was now an aging king, a man who was obsessed with his legacy, his soul, and the future of his kingdom. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The piety of the court, however, did not protect it from the ravages of war or the heartbreak of a dynasty in peril. The final decades of Louis XIV's reign were a period of great hardship for France. The wars he fought, while often glorious, were also incredibly costly. The revocation of the Edict of Nantes had weakened the French economy, and the king, for all his piety and his devotion, was a man who was about to face a series of devastating personal losses that would shake him to his core and threaten the very future of the Bourbon dynasty. He was a king who had everything, but he was about to lose it all. The sun, which had once shone so brightly, was beginning to set, and with it, the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. The shift in the court's atmosphere, from scandalous excess to pious devotion, was complete, but it did little to protect the king from the cruel whims of fate. For a man who had been blessed with a long and vigorous life, Louis XIV was about to face a series of devastating personal losses that would shake him to his core and threaten the very future of the Bourbon dynasty. He was a king who had everything, but he was about to discover that his immense power could not protect him from the relentless march of death. His legitimate heir, the Grand Dauphin Louis, was a man in his 50s, a quiet and unassuming figure who had spent his entire life in his father's shadow. He had been a loyal son, a dutiful heir, but he was not a man of great ambition or charisma. This is a mainstream historical fact. The Grand Dauphin was a bit of a disappointment to his father, a man who had been raised to be a king but who lacked the fire and the drive of the Sun King. He had a number of children, but his life was one of quiet solitude and a deep sense of his own inadequacy. You can feel the profound sadness of this man, a prince who was destined to be a king but who would never get the chance. The first blow to the dynasty came in 1711, when the Grand Dauphin died of smallpox. For the aging king, it was a devastating loss. He had loved his son, even if he had been disappointed in him, and his death was a stark reminder of his own mortality. It was also a political crisis. The line of succession now passed to the Grand Dauphin's son, Louis, the Duke of Burgundy. This was a man of a very different sort. He was pious, intelligent, and deeply committed to a life of virtue. He and his wife, Marie Adélaïde of Savoy, were a breath of fresh air at court, a couple who embodied the new pious atmosphere of Versailles. They were deeply in love, and they were the hope for the future of the Bourbon dynasty. But their time was tragically short. A quirky fringe tidbit from this time is that the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy were often seen as a political threat by the old guard at court, who saw their piety and their reforms as a challenge to their power. The court was a hotbed of intrigue, and rumours of poison and sorcery, a dark echo of the affair of the poisons, began to circulate once more. Whether these rumours were true or not, the results were the same. Within a year of the Grand Dauphin's death, both the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy were dead, having succumbed to a sudden mysterious illness, likely measles. For the aging king, it was an unimaginable tragedy. The death of his grandson and his beloved granddaughter-in-law was a blow from which he would never truly recover. Historians still argue whether the deaths of the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy were a tragic accident or a political assassination. Some scholars believe that they were simply victims of an infectious disease, a common tragedy in an era before modern medicine. Others argue that the timing of their deaths and the political rivals they had made suggests something more sinister. The king, for his part, was shattered. He had lost his heir, his grandson, and the woman who he had come to see as a beloved daughter. He was now an old man, and the future of his dynasty was in peril. The line of succession now passed to the Duke and Duchess of Burgundy's young son, a frail and sickly boy of 5, also named Louis. He was now the new Dauphin, the future King of France. The king, in a desperate attempt to secure the future of his dynasty, began to dote on the boy, protecting him from every illness, every possible danger. But the boy's younger brother, the Duke of Brittany, had also died, leaving the young Dauphin as the last remaining legitimate heir. The king, who had once been surrounded by children and grandchildren, was now a man alone, a man who was haunted by the ghosts of his lost family. But Louis had other children, his illegitimate children with Montespan, whom he had legitimized. He had a deep affection for them, and in a move that was both an act of love and a political gambit, he began to elevate their status, giving them titles and positions of power. He even, in a desperate attempt to secure the future of his dynasty, declared them eligible to succeed to the throne, a move that was met with shock and outrage by the old guard. This is a mainstream historical fact, and it was a move that was ultimately overturned after his death. But for Louis, it was a way to ensure that his legacy and his bloodline would continue, no matter what. The final decades of Louis XIV's reign were a period of great sorrow. The glory of his youth had faded, and he was now a man who was defined by his losses. He had lost his family, he had lost his health, and he was losing his kingdom to a series of costly wars. He was an old man, and he was tired. The sun, which had once shone so brightly, was now setting, and with it the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The king, once a vibrant and imposing figure, was now a portrait of an old man in mourning. The series of devastating deaths within his family, his son, his grandson, and his beloved granddaughter-in-law, had left him heartbroken, and had thrown the very future of the Bourbon dynasty into peril. You can feel the weight of his grief as he moves through the now subdued halls of Versailles, a ghost in a palace that he had built for his own glory. The once vibrant sun was now a dim winter light, casting long shadows on a court that was itself beginning to feel the heavy cost of a long reign. This is a mainstream historical fact. The War of the Spanish Succession, a brutal and costly conflict fought to secure the Spanish throne for his grandson, had drained the French treasury and had left the country exhausted. Louis, who had once been the master of Europe, was now a king on the defensive, a man who was fighting not just for his dynasty, but for the very survival of his kingdom. The glory of his youth, the military campaigns that had once been so successful, were now a distant memory. He was now a man who was defined by his losses, both personal and political. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this time is the incredible ingenuity of the French people in dealing with the crushing poverty and the military losses. While the king was mourning in his gilded cage, the people of Paris were developing a new kind of street theatre, a satirical, often bawdy form of entertainment that mocked the king and his court. Imagine a group of actors in a back alley, using puppets and clever rhymes to poke fun at the Sun King's misfortunes. It was a testament to the resilience of the French spirit, a way of using humour and wit to cope with a reality that was becoming increasingly bleak. The king's personal life, once a source of endless drama and scandal, was now a source of quiet solitude. He was a man who in his old age had found a profound sense of peace in the company of his wife, Madame de Maintenon. She was a woman who was not a dazzling beauty or a fiery personality, but a woman who was a comfort to him, a source of quiet strength, and a partner in his spiritual journey. She was the one who was at his side as he faced the tragedies that had befallen his family. She was the one who held his hand as he mourned the loss of his son and his grandchildren. She was the one who, with her quiet dignity, gave him a sense of peace in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic. Historians still argue whether Maintenon was a truly comforting presence for the king, or a more calculating figure who used his grief to consolidate her power. Some scholars argue that she was a woman of deep compassion who genuinely loved her husband and wanted to help him through his grief. Others argue that she was a master of the long game, a woman who knew that the king's grief was an opportunity to become an indispensable part of his life. The truth is likely a blend of both. She was a woman of immense power and influence, and she was also a woman who was in love with her husband, a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in her company. The king's final years were a period of great sorrow, but they were also a period of immense introspection. He was a man who in his old age was beginning to think about his legacy, about his soul, and about the afterlife. He was a man who, after a lifetime of scandal and excess, was beginning to crave a sense of order and spiritual redemption. He was a man who in his old age had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The king's most profound sorrow, however, was the death of his beloved grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and his granddaughter-in-law, Marie-Adélaïde. They were the hope for the future of the dynasty, a couple who embodied the new, pious atmosphere of Versailles. Their deaths were a blow from which the king would never truly recover. He was now a man who was defined by his losses, a man who was haunted by the ghosts of his lost family. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The long, slow decline of the Sun King's reign was not just a political or military one, it was a personal one. He was a man who was no longer chasing after fleeting pleasures. He was a man who was thinking about his legacy, about his soul, and about the future of his kingdom. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The sun, which had once shone so brightly, was beginning to set, and with it, the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. He was a king who had everything, but in the end, he was a man who had lost it all. The stage was now set for the final act of his life, an act that would be defined by his grief, his piety, and his quiet resignation to the inevitable. The long, slow decline of the Sun King's reign was a period of immense personal and dynastic peril. The deaths of his son, his grandson, and his beloved granddaughter-in-law were not just private sorrows, they were a public crisis, a brutal reminder that the divine right of kings did not offer immunity from the ravages of death. You can feel the court holding its breath, a silent dread hanging in the air as they watched their aging king, a man who had once seemed invincible, now so utterly human and so utterly vulnerable. The very future of the Bourbon dynasty was now hanging by a thread, a single, frail, 5-year-old boy. This is a mainstream historical fact. The king's great-grandson, Louis, Duke of Anjou, was now the heir to the throne. He was a small, sickly child who was being raised in the shadow of a dynasty that was on the verge of collapse. The king, a man who had once been so passionately involved in the affairs of the state and the scandals of his court, was now obsessed with the health and well-being of this one small boy. He was a king who was haunted by the ghosts of his lost family, a man who was living in a constant state of fear that this last remaining heir would also be taken from him. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this time is the incredible paranoia that gripped the court. The king, in his grief and his fear, was convinced that his family was being systematically poisoned. He began to distrust everyone, from the doctors who treated his great-grandson to the servants who prepared his food. He would often have his own meals prepared in a private locked kitchen, and he would have a trusted servant taste the food before he would eat it. This wasn't just a simple precaution, it was a symptom of a man who was no longer in control, a man who was living in a constant state of terror, a man who was haunted by the dark, whispering shadows of a world he no longer understood. The king's personal life, once a source of endless drama and scandal, was now a source of quiet solitude. He was a man who in his old age had found a profound sense of peace in the company of his wife, Madame de Maintenon. She was a woman who was a comfort to him, a source of quiet strength, and a partner in his spiritual journey. She was the one who was at his side as he faced the tragedies that had befallen his family. She was the one who held his hand as he mourned the loss of his son and his grandchildren. She was the one who, with her quiet dignity, gave him a sense of peace in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic. Historians still argue whether Maintenon was a truly comforting presence for the king or a more calculating figure who used his grief to consolidate her power. Some scholars argue that she was a woman of deep compassion, who genuinely loved her husband and wanted to help him through his grief. Others argue that she was a master of the long game, a woman who knew that the king's grief was an opportunity to become an indispensable part of his life. The truth is likely a blend of both. She was a woman of immense power and influence, and she was also a woman who was in love with her husband, a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in her company. The king's final years were a period of great sorrow, but they were also a period of immense introspection. He was a man who, in his old age, was beginning to think about his legacy, about his soul and about the afterlife. He was a man who, after a lifetime of scandal and excess, was beginning to crave a sense of order and spiritual redemption. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The most profound sorrow of the king's final years, however, was the death of his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and his granddaughter-in-law, Marie Adelaide. They were the hope for the future of the dynasty, a couple who embodied the new, pious atmosphere of Versailles. Their deaths were a blow from which the king would never truly recover. He was now a man who was defined by his losses, a man who was haunted by the ghosts of his lost family. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The long, slow decline of the Sun King's reign was not just a political or military one, it was a personal one. He was a man who was no longer chasing after fleeting pleasures. He was a man who was thinking about his legacy, about his soul, and about the future of his kingdom. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The sun, which had once shone so brightly, was beginning to set, and with it the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The stage was now set for the final act of his life, an act that would be defined by his grief, his piety, and his quiet resignation to the inevitable. The final sunset of the Sun King was a slow, deliberate affair, a period of solemnity and quiet resignation that was in stark contrast to the flamboyant glory of his youth. The king, once a vibrant and imposing figure, was now an old man, his body frail and his face lined with the grief of his many losses. You can feel the profound sadness that hangs over Versailles in those final days, a quiet hush that had replaced the constant bustling energy of his long reign. The court, for all its pomp and ceremony, was now a funeral procession waiting to happen, and the king, a man who had once been the master of all he surveyed, was now a man preparing to meet his end. This is a mainstream historical fact. In his final years, Louis XIV was plagued by a series of illnesses, including gangrene in his leg, which was a constant source of pain and suffering. He had lived a long and vigorous life, but his body was now failing him. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a profound sense of peace in the company of his wife, Madame de Maintenon. She was a woman who was a comfort to him, a source of quiet strength, and a partner in his spiritual journey. She was the one who was at his side as he faced the end of his life, a woman who, with her quiet dignity, gave him a sense of peace in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic. A quirky fringe tidbit from this time is the incredible resilience of the king's spirit. Despite the immense pain and suffering he was in, he still held court, he still attended to the affairs of the state, and he still maintained his sense of regal dignity. He would often have a small portable throne set up in his bedroom, where he would receive his ministers and his family. Imagine the scene. A man in immense pain, his body ravaged by illness, still holding on to the trappings of his power, a testament to his indomitable will and his sense of duty to his kingdom. The king's final days were a period of immense introspection. He was a man who, in his old age, was beginning to think about his legacy, about his soul, and about the afterlife. He was a man who, after a lifetime of scandal and excess, was beginning to crave a sense of order and spiritual redemption. He was a man who, in his old age, had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. He would spend hours in her apartments, not for physical passion, but for conversation, for intellectual companionship, and for a sense of peace that he had never found with his other lovers. Historians still argue whether the king's final piety was genuine or a performance for posterity. Some scholars argue that Louis, having seen the chaos and the scandal of his youth, was genuinely remorseful and wanted to make peace with God before he died. They point to his deep personal devotion and his increasing obsession with the affairs of the soul. Others argue that his piety was a final act of control, a way to shape his legacy and to ensure that he would be remembered as a pious and virtuous king. The truth is likely a blend of both. Louis was a man who saw no separation between his personal life and his political life, and his final piety served both his soul and his state. The king's most profound sorrow, however, was the death of his grandson, the Duke of Burgundy, and his granddaughter-in-law Marie Adelaide. They were the hope for the future of the dynasty, a couple who embodied the new, pious atmosphere of Versailles. Their deaths were a blow from which the king would never truly recover. He was now a man who was defined by his losses, a man who was haunted by the ghosts of his lost family. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The long, slow decline of the Sun King's reign was not just a political or military one, it was a personal one. He was a man who was no longer chasing after fleeting pleasures. He was a man who was thinking about his legacy, about his soul, and about the future of his kingdom. He was a man who in his old age had found a quiet and profound sense of peace in the company of a woman who was his wife in all but name. The sun, which had once shone so brightly, was beginning to set, and with it the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. He was a king who had everything, but in the end he was a man who had lost it all. The stage was now set for the final act of his life, an act that would be defined by his grief, his piety, and his quiet resignation to the inevitable. On September 1st, 1715, at the age of 76, Louis XIV, the Sun King, passed away. His death was a quiet affair, a moment of profound sadness for a kingdom that had known no other king. He had reigned for 72 years, the longest reigning monarch in European history, and in his final moments, he was surrounded by his family and his trusted confidants, including his wife, Maintenon. His death marked the end of an era, a period of immense glory and immense tragedy. He was a man who had built a kingdom, a man who had redefined the very nature of kingship, and a man who, in his final moments, was a man alone, a man who had lost everything but his sense of dignity and his quiet resignation to the inevitable. The sun had finally set, and with it, the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. The long, agonizing decline of the Sun King had finally ended. On September 1st, 1715, the most powerful monarch in Europe had passed away, and with his death, a 72-year reign, the longest in European history, came to a quiet close. The court of Versailles, which he had built as a monument to his glory, was now a place of profound sadness, a sombre echo of the vibrant, theatrical world he had once commanded. You can feel the change in the air, a sense of an era ending, a profound stillness that had replaced the constant buzzing energy of his reign. The sun had finally set, and France, and indeed Europe, was about to enter a new, uncertain age. This is a mainstream historical fact. Louis XIV's death was not met with universal grief. For many in France, the king's final years had been a period of immense hardship. The costly wars he had fought, the revocation of the Edict of Nantes, and the crushing poverty of the French people had left the country exhausted and resentful. His funeral procession was met not with silent mourning, but with a surprising display of public celebration, a grim reminder that the Sun King's legacy, for all its glory, was also one of immense suffering. A quirky, fringe tidbit from this time is the incredible ingenuity of the French people in dealing with the crushing poverty and the military losses. While the king was mourning in his gilded cage, the people of Paris were developing a new kind of street theatre, a satirical, often bawdy form of entertainment that mocked the king and his court. Imagine a group of actors in a back alley, using puppets and clever rhymes to poke fun at the Sun King's misfortunes. It was a testament to the resilience of the French spirit, a way of using humour and wit to cope with a reality that was becoming increasingly bleak. The king's most profound and lasting legacy, however, was not his military victories or his political cunning, but his transformation of France and his creation of Versailles. The palace, which had once been a small hunting lodge, was now a symbol of absolute power, a masterpiece of architecture and a monument to human vanity. It was a place where the king had centralised all power, where he had tamed a rebellious nobility, and where he had created a new kind of social order. It was a place where love and lust were inextricably linked with power and politics. Historians still argue whether Louis XIV's reign was a brilliant political masterstroke or an act of monumental ego that ultimately bankrupted the country. Some scholars argue that by centralising the nobility and keeping them occupied with courtly life, Louis prevented another Fronde, ensuring centuries of stability for the French monarchy. Others argue that the immense cost of the palace, both in money and in the erosion of regional power, ultimately weakened France and sowed the seeds for the French Revolution over a century later. The truth is likely a blend of both. It was an act of pure genius and pure hubris, all rolled into one. The king's personal life, once a source of endless drama and scandal, was also a profound part of his legacy. His love affairs, from the pure devotion of Louise de la Vallière to the theatrical ambition of Montespan and the quiet piety of Maintenon, were not just a series of disconnected flings. They were an integral part of his political strategy, a way of rewarding loyalty, punishing dissent, and creating a new power structure that was entirely dependent on him. He was a man who understood that to control the state, he had to control the hearts and minds of the people within it, and that included their lusts and their ambitions. And in the end, it was the king's quiet, pious wife, Madame de Maintenon, who had the most profound and lasting impact on his final years. She was a woman who was a comfort to him, a source of quiet strength, and a partner in his spiritual journey. She was the one who was at his side as he faced the end of his life, a woman who, with her quiet dignity, gave him a sense of peace in a world that was becoming increasingly chaotic. Her influence, however, did not die with the king. She would live for several more years, a quiet and revered figure who had been the last and most profound chapter in the Sun King's tumultuous love life. The lasting legacy of Louis XIV is a complex and fascinating one. He was a man who had built a kingdom, a man who had redefined the very nature of kingship, and a man who had created a legacy that would be talked about for centuries. He was a man who had everything, but in the end, he was a man who had lost it all. The sun had finally set, and with it, the hopes and dreams of a dynasty in peril. The long and slow decline of the Sun King's reign was a period of immense personal and dynastic peril. The deaths of his son, his grandson, and his beloved granddaughter-in-law were not just private sorrows. They were a public crisis, a brutal reminder that the divine right of kings did not offer immunity from the ravages of death. As you close your eyes, you can almost hear the final echoes of a king's life, the gentle hum of the fan, the rustle of leaves outside your window, the quiet rhythm of your own breathing. It's a soothing soundtrack to the end of a very long, very complicated story. The Sun King, a man who had once been the centre of his universe, is now just a whisper in the pages of history. But his ghost, and the ghosts of his passions and his palace, still linger, a reminder that even the most powerful of men are ultimately just human. He was a man who had lived a life of immense glory and immense tragedy, a man who had built a palace and a kingdom, and a man who, in the end, was a man alone, a man who had lost everything but his sense of dignity and his quiet resignation to the inevitable. And so, as we leave the halls of Versailles and the long shadow of the Sun King, let the final images of this journey fade. The magnificent hall of mirrors, now dim and quiet. The whispering shadows in the secret gardens, no longer holding a lover's tryst but a deep and abiding silence. The weight of the world, of a long life lived and lost, is lifting from your shoulders. It's time to let go of the intrigue, the passion, and the peril. It's time to let the quiet take over. Let the final moments of this journey be about peace, not about power. Feel your body relax into the quiet comfort of the night, your mind drifting into the gentle hum of the darkness. The king is dead, the story is over, and all is well.